Hey everybody. Life's been a bit more challenging lately for all of us, to put it mildly. And, things have changed very dramatically in our culture since the last time I made a video. And they're still changing. And they're not going to stop changing anytime soon. Not in any way that I can understand. However, the domains in which change will occur and the reasons for which that change will occur are important to us as human beings. Partly because we are, at least, here in white middle-class America, we're used to having things being predictable. Now, when I use a phrase like white middle-class America, it's a phrase we can all understand. Something about, what population segment I imagine that to point to. And I don't presume that that my listeners are all part of that segment. In fact, I hope they're not. I use that segment because it's the one that many people would use to point to me, right? Which in some ways would work and in some ways would be catastrophically wrong. So one of the things we use language to do is to, how shall I put this? To walk down a ladder of identity from the everything to something. And then we point at that something, and that something is generally a person, place, thing, process, quality, so on. So breathing is a process, a person is a being, but we understand in English beings as things, objects, which is part of the problem that we have with our relationships with language and knowledge. And what I mean by that is the habitual relationships we have with language and knowledge often begin by misframing that which language points toward. And some of those misframings are catastrophically, they're just terribly malformed. They're deformed. And the language doesn't tell us what something is. We often treat it as though it does. And in our consciousness, over time, as we emerge from childhood, from the sort of dreaming of childhood, in the direction of maturity, language becomes more prevalent in its capacity to predetermine identities, relationships, qualities, opportunities, threats, and so on. And most of that is unfortunate, even though it's very useful in some ways. The reason most of it is unfortunate is, as I said previously, our relationships and habits with language are inclined to deform what we experience of reality. And this is part of why, as we mature, moving from childhood into adulthood, this is part of why, for many of us, particularly those of us who are not artists or creative in some way, our imaginations begin to die. And so instead of imagining things, we pay others to imagine things for us. Instead of singing or music. We pay others to sing and make music for us. Instead of dreaming and entering into adventurous relationships where we have playful, creative, sometimes heroic roles, we get jobs, and people play what would otherwise be our adventurous lives back to us on screens in search of great sums of money, advertising, and audiences, and so on. And I think that's tragic, and it's something that I want to transform. That's something I want to change. The topic of my talk today is one that I've orbited in a number of recent videos, but is still deeply on my mind every day. It's the topic of the relationship between ambiguity, or more actively, re-ambiguation, and knowledge, opinion, belief. These are the products of disambiguation. The other night I was talking with a family member who declared that white people had become a minority in the United States. And I thought, how could that be possible? So during the conversation I looked up census numbers, and according to the last census, white or Caucasian people comprise 76.3, if I remember the number correctly, % of the population of America. And the adult who I was speaking with refused to believe that, and was completely committed to the pre-existing belief that somehow our nation had been invaded by immigrants and people from other countries to the degree that we now represented a minority. Hard to imagine how a person could come to that perspective, except that the political climate and the news and propaganda climate have a vested interest, meaning they make money, when they produce fear or outrage in certain populations, or if they can misdirect responsibility for problems in our society that, though they have various origins, are largely the result of our standing failure to have assembled anything resembling a mutually forged, nobly impurposed, intelligent society to which we all can belong with a sense of pride and humanity and peaceful cooperation. Since we've failed to forge something like that, and instead we're sort of conscripts, right? Or subscribers or slaves to something else, something that masquerades as a society we assembled when we didn't assemble it. We are subject to it. Now, as I'm speaking, I'm using language to disambiguate some extremely ambiguous situations. For example, the nature and origins of what we call our society. But it isn't our society. It never was. We didn't forge it. And that's why it isn't. And that's why it's incapable of protecting us or establishing intelligent relationships that are mutually beneficial, between our citizens, all of our citizens, all people. And, you know, this is sort of the advertisement of America, right? That all of the people who live here, being, you know, all of us being immigrants, since there isn't any other way to be an American, and all of those Americans being, at least in some way, complicit in the ongoing colonization of these lands that were previously and traditionally the home of indigenous people, who themselves, at some point, probably in relatively ancient history, thousands, tens of thousands, or 50,000 years ago, came to this continent. We may presume that at that time there probably weren't other people here that they displaced. So this thing we call a nation has a very strange history, and it's not like the cartoons that we paint of it. And that's part of why it doesn't function to serve or protect or educate or heal or encourage and reassure and ennoble and nurture our citizens, all of our citizens, which is, in fact, the essential mandate of an intelligently forged society. And ours doesn't do that. It does all kinds of other shit, really dangerous shit, a lot of really bizarre, violent, militaristic shit, a lot of completely unnecessary and sort of, what's the right word here, inflationary consumer corporate shit, banking and luxury goods and, you know, bizarre competitions between companies to capture the dollar or the attention of an audience and thus make a profit. It's a funny word, that. So unfortunately, we're in a situation where we're being disillusioned, I would say. We're being disillusioned. In other words, we're being slowly deprived of the illusion, or the whole library of illusions that we held about the nature of our nation and our society, its purposes, functions, its priorities, its infrastructure, its origins, its leaders, the nature of power, the nature of subjugation. We're being disillusioned, meaning our illusions are being torn away, and the fictions we have so long been satisfied with have been thoroughly penetrated both by the epidemic, which is still quite mysterious and bizarre, regardless of what anyone likes to think about it. We don't know much about, in fact, what do we know much about, right? We have really tiny, superficial, we're used to producing tags that we hook onto things to pretend that we know what they are so that we can stop being afraid. So I've been told that's a tree. It's a beautiful being. But the tag has nothing to do with what that is. And the same is true of all of the tags we use, of righteousness, of honor, of nobility, of intelligence, of heroism. We have tags, we have tokens, and unfortunately for us, our kinds of intelligence are prone, they are inclined, they are vulnerable to replacing relationships with tokens. And those tokens are the result of disambiguation activity. In order for me to decide what this thing is, here, right? I have to go through a series of habitual disambiguations, from the everything to something, to a machine, to a car. But I can do that process in all kinds of different ways. And the waking mind is inclined to prefer concrete derivatives, and that's what I mean by tokens. So if I see a human being, for example, there's lots of different ways I can do the disambiguation, right? And this is part of what our country and our society is confused about and arguing about right now. I can see a human being, and I can see in that human being the divine origins of being itself, if I believe there are such origins, if I believe that origins and beings are divine. They don't have to be divine to remain sufficiently ambiguous to relate intelligently with them. They can simply be mysterious or unknown, right? In other words, from beyond the known, from outside the library of tokens that we use. Someone can look at me and they can see something mysterious. They can see an instance of the nature of time-space. They can see a soul. They can see the expression of a vast history of ancestral progenitors. They can see me as a collective of trillions of complex microorganisms that develop symbiotic relationships over the history of life on Earth. They can see me as an exponent of the history of life on Earth. They can see me as a playmate. They can see me as a possible teammate or a co-adventurer. They can see me as a writer, an author, a philosopher, a teacher, a companion, a lover, a friend. They can see me as a man. They can see me as a middle-aged man, or they can see me as a white middle-aged man. The way they do that, the way we go through that process of disambiguation is the result of our purposes in doing so. Now, I want you to see how powerful it is when we are freed to see the continuum of identity that is accessible to us. And so I gave you a brief example. But if there is anyone, who decides that, for example, the color of my skin is the important determinative quality in how they're going to relate with me, then part of what is happening there is that rather than seeing me as any of those amazing things I described, they're going to see me as a population segment that is either aligned with their goals, purposes, and beliefs, or opposes it, or is neutral. And this is part of the problem that we're having, is that instead of seeing human beings, we're seeing colors for purposes. Now, some people might argue that I should be deplatformed because, due to my ethnicity, a characteristic ascribed to me, I belong to both the privileged and the empowered population segment here in the United States. And that's a reasonably comprehensible disambiguation. I neither agree nor disagree. I have no position on that at the moment. It's not my purpose to disambiguate that way. So, for me, while I understand that someone else might have that purpose and might say, I have no right to speak at all on such matters, that's their process of disambiguation. I don't have to subscribe, nor do I really have to have an opinion at all What I have is a perspective and some purposes. And one of my purposes is to reveal the processes that underlie how people come to think of phenomena with which they're relating. Yeah, like this stuff. So this stuff is called nature, generally. It's one of the ways we disambiguate it. But what that word means to me is something so different from what it means to ordinary people that I might as well be walking through the living body of a god or the anciently conserved relationships that are the embodiment of the intelligences in space-time. I am in a world very few others who I know can even detect. And it's because my purpose and the way that I disambiguate is very differently forged from many people's. But what I want to get at here is that the waking mind likes solid, tokenized deliverables. It wants to know, is that a black man? Is that a white woman? Is that an Asian man, an Asian woman? Is that, is that person is their segment in power? Is their segment in being subjugated? They have desires, right? To make determinations for purposes. And most of those purposes are not very good. They're not humane. They're not intelligent. They are the purposes of creating and reinforcing factions. And some of those factions have to be understood deeply and seen through the lens of their origins and purposes to be understood. Now, I'm not going, it is not my intention today at all to try to disambiguate the pile of spaghetti nightmare that is the current situation in our country regarding racism. I'm going to steer mostly clear of that bombshell. And instead, what I'm going to talk about is the mechanics that we use to arrive at tokens. And the way that tokens stand really between us and relationships, or they stand in the place where relationships would otherwise exist. And if we look at the problems surrounding racism in our country, we can see very simply that something like this has happened. Tokens have been produced. Those tokens created factions. The factions are they are in a dichotomy, or they are arrayed against one another, for and against one another. And the police themselves are a faction unto themselves. They are a specially, strangely privileged group. More privileged even than, well, not as privileged perhaps as the elite, the extremely wealthy, but more privileged than people who we might otherwise understand to be privileged, because they, well, in one sense, it's always been this way. It's a sort of old boys network, the cops. And by old boys, I don't mean there aren't women cops. I just mean it resembles the networks developed by old white males primarily. And they're empowered for all kinds of different reasons. They have a unique relationship with the law. They have a unique relationship with violence. They are capable of legally enacting lethal force, that is to kill. They are capable of killing. They are armed. They are funded. And they are expected to carry out the mandates of the instruments of power that they are representative of. And those mandates are quite complex. They have a superficial social face, right? In other words, an outward-facing costume, yeah, or mask. And then they have an inward-facing identity, an array of expectations and roles and so on. And trust me when I say those two things are very different. Police talk to each other in ways they do not talk to the public. Let's put it that way. There's a private language and there's a public language. And we're all somewhat like that, right? We all have sort of a private face, the face of ourselves facing inward into ourselves, and a public face, the face of ourselves facing outward toward the public. And many of us are very concerned about both of those faces, but particularly the one that faces the public, because if that one should become tarnished or in some way injured or impoverished, we will suffer. And one of the problems that we have in the bizarre situation in which our society finds itself at the moment, the bizarre yet absolutely familiar situation, is that the public face of certain population segments begins in a way that is impoverished, unjustly impoverished, and those people, no matter what the color of their skin, no matter what their gender, no matter what their origins, no matter how they actually live in the world, can be instantaneously judged, harmed, killed, tortured, impoverished, denied health care, denied rights, denied education, treated as others even though they are citizens, treated as enemies even though they are companions. And no matter what population segment we belong to, we've probably experienced something like this. I have. One day in my life, cops came to my house, two female cops, white female cops, and literally told me, without me having been accused of any crime or wrongdoing, that they were going to take me out into a field and make me disappear, and that there was nothing that I or my family or my lawyer or anybody could do about that. That was their initial way of getting to know me. Now, I, being a, Caucasian guy, right, can easily understand that I must have got off easy. Because I've seen and heard of lots of other instances where, cops decided to disambiguate identity in a way that led to the horrifying injury or murder or killing or rape or other terrible, outcome for some person who they encountered. And let's be clear about something relatively simple. An encounter with police is, in our time, an encounter with the possibility of death. Doesn't mean you're going to die, but it does mean that your population segment will be disambiguated in a way that the police find convenient and habitual, and that will influence the outcome, whether you live or die, are permanently injured, are psychologically scarred for life, and so on and so forth. So you can see that one of the things the police are doing is they're disambiguating, right? That's their job. Their job is to discover what is happening and who is doing it and what the cause is. That's a process of disambiguation. And the primary result is the purpose of this disambiguation is to determine if, well, again, there's a public purpose and a private purpose, right? So this is much more complex than it might at first seem. The stated public superficial purpose is apparently to preserve what we refer to as law and order, which means the lawful behavior, orderly behavior towards society, goods, property, and each other. The hidden purposes are so complex it would take hours to try to elucidate them. I'm sure you're capable of imagining many of them. And some of them just include things like just sadistically torturing common people because they can get away with it. Now, I'm not claiming that all the cops do that, but the segment that the police represent is empowered to do terrible things to common people and is largely protected from the results of having done terrible things to common people. And in case that isn't clear, the organization in my city, a very liberal city, San Francisco, whose mandate it is to process and track complaints against the police, the Bureau of Citizen Complaints or something like this. In the year when I submitted a complaint after having been essentially kidnapped from my house by 2 police officers who were essentially intent on torturing me simply because they could get away with it. One of those police officers is still an officer. Her name is Elaine Economist, and she was the primary perpetrator. In the year that I submitted my complaint, the Office of Citizen Complaints lost, I think, 87% of the complaints that were submitted to it. Its only job is to track and process complaints against police. It lost 87% of them. And it wasn't just that year, it was many years. So my point is that there are segments of society that enjoy the privilege of being relatively free from having to answer for wrongdoing. Now, answering for wrongdoing is a very complex topic, but if one belongs to an association of adult human beings whose mandate is to protect and serve the people of our nation in a way that is just and humane and fair and intelligent, that mandate is not being carried out, and other bizarre motivations are certainly being carried out at a very high percentage of, the results of encounters with citizens. Part of the problem is that police have power, right? They have power over common people in that they have the power to radically or permanently change the course of a human life, a person they encounter, by accusing them of something or pretending they were doing something. Now, when I had my encounter with the police, one of the things I didn't realize at the time because I was naive is that by declaring they were going to take me out into a field and make me disappear, essentially that they're going to kill me, they were trying to up the ante, right? They wanted, I believe, I don't know exactly what was going on. And by the way, to know what was going on, we have to disambiguate. And we do that for purposes. And if the purposes change, the result changes, right? It's the same with beliefs, opinions, ideas, knowledge. But there's something very surprising here that I'll get to in a moment about this. In any case, their purpose was to cause me to react in such a way that would mandate or justify violence against my person, right? So apparently, at least officer economists thought, if I can scare the crap out of this guy or threaten him, then he will react in such a way that will allow me to continue to justify my actual purpose, which is to cause him harm, right? It's a startling and unexpected result of a relatively innocuous encounter. And it's not like there's no backstory to the encounter, but the backstory isn't really important here. What's important is that police have the ability, anyone who's armed has a unique array of abilities to disambiguate in a way that an unarmed person is ill-equipped to contend with. But police, when they arrive on the scene of a situation, or if they encounter a situation, they have a great deal of power. And if that power is misused, the result is atrocity, invariably. And they serve a system that, from my perspective, the way that I disambiguate it, is largely oriented to produce and continue and catalyze atrocity. The system of courts and prisons. And in our country, those systems are businesses, right? They're essentially for-profit businesses. And if you think cops have power, you should see the powers that accrue to people who are, for example, lawyers or judges, because those people have the capacity to function in the framework in ways that ordinary people cannot, much as cops do. So, there are many situations when the police or the courts at least partly accomplish the mandate for which we imagine they originated, right? However, in our culture, the idea of wrongdoing is treated as an accounting game, which is a very bizarre idea, particularly where it relates to corporations, because corporations can only be financially punished, right? So they can commit all kinds of murder and atrocity and violate, obliterate the oceans for generations to come, burn down the rainforest, frack the underground aquifers and fill them with radioactive waste and poison. And the worst thing that can happen to them is they get a fine. So that's an incredibly dangerous situation where ordinary humans, where the future of life on Earth is competing against this bizarre sort of monstrous entity that's not even human. It's an array of functions that are generally designed to produce harm in the environment, hide that harm, and then return astonishing tokens of wealth to those participating in that harm. These moths have been very numerous. For about the past week and a half, maybe. Now, when I saw that phenomenon, I had to disambiguate, right? I had to go from everything to something, to this process, to this event. And what I want to make clear, what I want you to understand, is that disambiguation is at least a binary phenomenon, in the sense that as I decide what a phenomenon is, for example, this is a California sagebrush. Love this plant. Amazingly beautiful organism. Love this thing. I love these. As I decide what something is, there's a kind of illusory process that happens where I think I'm determining what something else is or isn't, but what I'm actually at the same time determining is the shape of my own mind and my own potentials for relation with that being, that process, that phenomenon, that thing, that quality. So as I'm traversing the tree from everything to something to determine what that is, right? I'm at the same time. Isn't it funny that our police cars are black and white? wonder if that's part of the problem. Never occurred to me before. I'm sure it's occurred to other people though. As I'm traversing the tree of identities, and I'm coming down toward a concrete derivative or knowledge. That guy just threw a bunch of ice out of his ice chest, right? In order to make that statement, I had to do a bunch of very sophisticated cognitive work that has become habitual to me now that I am quote unquote an adult. But when I was a child, it was not yet habitual, and that means I was still partly dreaming, and ambiguity was a very common aspect of my everyday experience moment to moment. Ambiguity was everywhere. That person could just as easily be my best friend as they could be a stranger. They weren't a stranger simply because I didn't know them, right? Children have to be taught that there's such a thing as a stranger. And that word by itself is a lethally complex token, right? It implies that the safe and correct choice, path of action with people who are unknown to us is to treat them with suspicion, with doubt, to treat them as a threat. And primarily, one of the most important features of disambiguation is it allows us to determine on the fly whether we're facing a threat, something we don't have to pay attention to, something neutral, an opportunity, something we should engage with, or would be good to engage with, beneficial to engage with, or something unknown. And people are very nervous about things being unknown. The waking mind depends on full disambiguation on, what it experiences as complete disambiguation, right? I know that this is a sprinkler head. For a child, it's a different situation. That thing could be anything. It could be a monster, a dinosaur, a toy, something that could hurt me, something scary. A child doesn't know what things are yet. Well, small children, they don't know yet. Because they're still learning to emulate the habits of disambiguation familiar in their culture, with the adults they're exposed to, and with their peer groups. It is possible to suspend the process of disambiguation, and I would argue that if you're capable of doing that, you're going to experience wonder, awe, terror, and joy. But learning to suspend that process as an adult is a very challenging thing. It's one of the things that meditation traditions are organized to assist in. Right? We still have to do the work ourselves, but many forms of meditation will reveal the process of disambiguation to you consciously so that you will sense when you are doing it and why. And this will give you new degrees of liberty in that process. And my talk today is oriented to catalyze something similar. I want us to be conscious of the power of disambiguation, of determining what things are. I want us to be conscious of the processes and purposes for which we engage in this behavior commonly. And I also want to talk about the flip side of that coin. But before I do that, I want to get back to what I was saying a little while ago. What we don't realize is that as if we were a bird that could fly in 100 different dimensions, as we traverse the tree from everything to something, we're actually throwing away wings, right? We're saying, well, I'm not going to fly in that dimension. I'm not going to fly in that dimension. I'm not going to fly in this one, right? And when I talked about initially how someone who saw me might disambiguate me, they might see like, oh, there is the face of time-space itself embodied in a being capable of the conscious relationship with nature and their own intelligence, of expressing uncommon human intelligence and maybe even transhuman intelligence. There is something astonishing. There is a miraculous being, right? Someone who sees a miraculous being before them, beautiful and good and filled with the opportunity for noble relations, beneficial and mutual interactions. Someone who sees this is much more likely to experience that than somebody who sees a white middle-class male. Those are both available disambiguations of the phenomenon of encountering me, Darren. And so when we're disambiguating, we are under the mistaken impression that we're determining the identity of extrinsic phenomenon and beings and things and objects and processes and such. But actually what we're doing at the same time, it's not that we're not doing that, but at the same time, we're actually determining our identity. And in many ways, if we could see the freedoms we throw away in that process, our lives and minds would be absolutely transformed. And we would be incapable of many of the injustices that are common to our personal and collective experience. And we would be incapable of forming organizations whose purposive foundation is the commission of atrocity for profit or power. We would become uninterested in those things, maybe permanently. So what I want to make very clear is that as adult humans disambiguate phenomenon, what they're actually doing is they're disambiguating their own identity, and they're not aware of that. And if we could become aware of that together, we would gain types of liberty we have never been bold enough to imagine yet. And that is my hope. That is my dream. Now, the other side of the coin of disambiguation is ambiguity, right? And when we have a belief or an opinion, right, when we have an argument, we make a statement, we have a position, then we become inclined to defend a very specific disambiguation of some phenomenon, right? We become inclined to be willing to argue, to have conflict, maybe to go to war, possibly to kill, to preserve and reinforce a specific disambiguation we have previously made. Just as when the man I was speaking with the other night, I think it was last night, the night before, said that that white people had become a minority in the United States. What could that possibly mean? But this person, who I'm very close to, was absolutely committed to this particular disambiguation and did not care a bit about the statistics or the numbers or anything. Completely refused to even entertain any other idea. Yeah? So that person had become, they had completely disambiguated this topic. They had an opinion and a position that they were interested in defending. But what that meant, ironically, wasn't really anything about the question. A position that confused is actually about the unimaginably and cruelly narrow result, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, of them having either done that disambiguation themselves or been told that, which is almost certainly what happened, right? By some particular news organization or something. Having taken that on, that then becoming part of their internal, felt and known perspective of their own identity, right? And of the situation outside of them, the public situation. A disambiguation which has purposes like to promote the idea that they have the right to feel threatened, right? That's one of the purposes in that kind of disambiguation. My point, though, is that the result deprives that individual of libraries of kinds of freedom. When they come to that conclusion, their humanity has become so narrow that it's no longer reasonably inhabitable. And yet we do this all the time. This is what we were trained to do as children. And this is part of why, as we grew older, for most of us who are not artists and creative, and even for some of those people, vast forests in our imagination died. They just disappeared. They went away. And for many of us, they will never come back. Because those habits are deeply entrenched, they are socially and publicly reinforced. Their opposites are rare. Their opposites are rarely nurtured. We will almost never find contexts in which we are encouraged to understand the possibilities of our human intelligence, to embrace their noblest potentials, to express those, to be rewarded for that, to have that process nurtured and encouraged, to be reassured that the beauty of the minds that we are born with is more valuable than the structured identities we see instanced in modern, like, sort of mainstream culture, and many of the side cultures as well. So many of the side cultures that appear superficially radical are just they're just like, they've got a painted face, right? It's the same consumer bullshit with a face painted on it of some kind of, noble, metaphysical, or spiritual perspective. But once that charade is penetrated, we find the same kind of disease broiling under the surface. And again, not universally. There are people in contexts whose goals and capacities for intelligent humanity are profound. Occasionally we can encounter them, but if we can't encounter them, and this is the very important thing I'm trying to say, if we can't encounter them, we can compose them together. And that's what we must do. And that's what our failure to do, our failure to have done that, leads to the situations we find ourselves in today. So this is the crucial thing we can do. And we can do it with 2 people, right? We can do it with 5 people. We can do it for 10 minutes. We can do a tiny little piece. We don't have to transform the world overnight. We can get together and explore and learn in ways that are astonishing and beautiful and noble. And we can tell that they're good intrinsically, because we can feel in our hearts and in our spirits and in our minds when new degrees of liberty that had previously been lost are being returned. The same way we can sense that this person who thinks that white people are a minority in America, in the same way that person's humanity has been narrowed, right, to a defender of some kind of nonsense, some sort of racist nonsense. Now, you can see also, though, that it's sort of important that I encountered someone like that, right? Because they help me to understand what the problem is, or what the underlying foundations of the problems we face, where they come from. And one of the places they come from is mispurposed disambiguation, right? Determining what things are in a way that is clumsy, unintelligent, habitual, serves organizations and people who have acquired power over us, or who we have somehow inadvertently granted power over us. So let me just remind you that as we disambiguate together, and I'm doing, this is really funny, I'm disambiguating the process of disambiguation, which is kind of a meta disambiguation. But I'm hoping to return some of the liberties that are natural to our human minds, our hearts, and our intelligences. Now, one of the kind of strange results of our fascination with disambiguation is that our relationship with ambiguity is damaged. And although our waking mind is extremely focused on disambiguating while we're awake, it's doing it all the time, and it's not disambiguating everything all the way down to concrete tokens. It's doing enough disambiguation that it can determine whether something's a threat, neutral, or an opportunity, and then sort of, guide us through that landscape. Because if we're comfortable that there are no threats we have to attend, then we can go back to doing whatever sort of leisurely or whatever activity we would prefer to be doing. And most of those activities are not particularly fulfilling anyway. Though some of them are. So we use disambiguation to produce tokens. Language is evidence of historically completed disambiguations. That's what language partly is. It produces tokens, little tags that we can, attach to phenomenon, like these plants, right? As long as I know those are plants, so they're not going to jump up and attack me, and neither are they going to throw money at me. So, unless I have some specific interest in them, which in fact I do, I don't need to pay any further attention to them. I can get on with the business at hand. But ambiguity is incredibly important for intelligence and for memory. And in fact, our dreams reintroduce ambiguity into relationships and identities so that our memory can survive the deprivations that disambiguation imposes on it. And this is a complex topic that I won't have time to explore in depth, but ambiguity is the foothold that invites imagination to life, right? At night, when it's dark and you can't see exactly what everything is, the wood in the trees begins to take on the likeness of faces. We might experience pareidolia, which is the visual detection of forms in the patterns of grass or the leaves or clouds or the wood grain on the wall or the structure of stones. And ambiguity links us to a situation in which our imagination can come to life and participate directly in transforming our own role. And that word transforming is kind of appropriately punny, because ambiguity and trance are related. In dreaming, though upon awakening we disambiguate identities and say, I dreamt I saw my father at his house. What actually was going on was that I saw someone who represented my father. There was ambiguity there. At a house that represented his house, there was ambiguity there. So in dreaming, identities, they can collapse very closely to specifics, I think, though it's dangerous to ask the waking mind questions about dreaming, because it's like asking sand about water. But in dreaming, ambiguity is preserved, and that means our imaginal faculties and emotions that we are not ordinarily capable of having come back to life. And what do I mean by emotions we're not capable of having? Don't we know what all of our emotions are? No, we certainly don't. Not in a world where everything's perfectly ambiguated. Look at the emotions of children and compare them to the emotions of adults. Which one has more range, right? It's not the adults in general. You can say, well, adults have developed sophisticated emotional. Yeah, go ahead, say that. I won't entirely disagree with you, but that's an insufficient observation in my view. The range of emotions available to children is vastly broader than the range of emotions, and more intense and deeper. And now, I'm not saying that we don't acquire new opportunities for sophisticated emotional experience and expression as adults. We do. But what we lose in that process is profoundly significant. And part of the reason for that is that the child's experience of the world is vastly more ambiguous than the adult's. Much that there's ambiguity everywhere for the child's imagination to interface with, even though most people who know me know I don't prefer mechanical and computational metaphors. The ambiguity in the child's experience and the ambiguity in the experience of an adult who has been returned to a childlike state in play or through enchantment or slightly, I think, somewhat unfortunately, through the introduction of intoxicants, which is part of why adults are doing intoxicants in the first place, is that their common adult experience feels so deprived of role and meaningful identity and adventure and meaningful purpose that they become vulnerable to the introduction of substances that mimic but don't deliver wonder, joy, interest, ecstasy, momentum, motivation. And that's a tragic compromise of our personhood in general. Addiction is a terrifying experience. And, you know, children can experience it too, right? They can be addicted to ice cream or video games or their smartphones. And now, in modern times, there are many more dangers for children than there were when I was younger, because the modern context is so dissociated and disembodied, primarily by emulating the machines with which we so constantly interact. And I'm interacting with them right now. I spend more time with this smartphone than I spend with human beings. And even when I'm spending time with human beings, the smartphone is between me and them most of the time. In other words, this device occupies the between of my relationships, and that is sickening, terrifying, and can only have unimaginably bad outcomes, particularly because the corporations behind our relationship with machines, those corporations have invaded the between of our relationships, a place that should be private to us, and are using that invasion to form profiles with which we can be directly manipulated, emotionally, psychologically, relationally, financially, all kinds of ways. And that statement that I just made is me disambiguating this phenomenon, right? It's not the only thing that can go on, but you saw what happened. I had a purpose, right? I made a bunch of disambiguations, sewed them together into a relatively coherent whole, and presented them as my perspective. It's true that those aren't the only things that are the results of our relationships with machines. For many years, I supported myself and my family, and still to some degree this day I do that. Because people need help relating with machines. It's a rather tragic misuse of my abilities, but as they say, it pays the bills. Another disambiguation. But I'd like to leave you today with the observation that the nature of nature is not disambiguated in the ways that our languages and habits of language and token use demand. Nature has both identity and ambiguity, and it preserves both of them. In fact, the representational intelligence with which we are infected as children is profoundly powerful. Unfortunately, for most of us, we will experience primarily the impoverishments of that power. in comparison to the relatively minimal benefits it confers. Because we will learn to disambiguate in ways that deprive us of intelligence, of freedom, of the capacity to forge meaningful, noble societies together, or at least the inclination to do so, not the capacity. We always have the capacity. We will enter a world filled with pre-made tokens and representations, and most of us will believe in it. But there are infinite worlds near at hand, beyond that constricting prison, that the tags we learn to believe, to propose, to assert, to fight over comprise prizes. So let us become conscious together of the powers and capacities with which we are born, and how our common habits with language, knowledge, society, identity, and purpose deprive us of these abilities, and how perhaps those very same powers can return them to us. Our world and our people, all the people, and all the living beings depend on our ability to awaken to something resembling the intelligence and nobility of which we're capable as human beings. May we find a way, this day and all our days, together, to move in that direction. In that tree is a beehive. Bye-bye for now.